The government quickly turned to military force to crush the protests, deploying more and more tanks. Opposing forces continued to fight for the upper hand, but mid-2013 saw chemical weapons used in an attack.
Life in Syria has been and remains unfairly fragile for two reasons: the more than decade-long civil war and the region's unique vulnerability to earthquakes. These realities remind residents every day that they live in one of the most unsafe regions on Earth. With more than half of Syria's population displaced due to the ongoing civil war, citizens were doing their best to be optimistic for brighter days ahead. Unfortunately, many lives were again shattered, this time by a devastating earthquake. Will Syria be allowed to let their wounds heal and live happily again? Syria's civil war began in 2011 after protesters were inspired by successful uprisings in the Middle East. The people are calling for an end to the oppressive regime of Bashar al-Assad. They protested against corruption, unemployment, a crumbling infrastructure, worsening access to decent healthcare, electricity, food, and water. Realizing no one was listening, the pro-democracy demonstrators took to the streets. The Syrian government responded with a violent crackdown on protesters, which marked the beginning of a civil war. The Assad government was backed by Iran and Russia, while the anti-government rebel groups were supported by Saudi Arabia, France, and the US. Assad was determined to crush what he called foreign-backed terrorism, and his forces have retaken control of major opposition strongholds previously controlled by Syrian rebels. This period saw the rise of the Islamic State, aka ISIS, and Al-Qaeda, who joined the war and attacked each other. Over 580,000 people have died from March 2011 to December 2022, around 1.5% of the country's population. Reports say thousands of civilians continue to end up casualties, with these deaths rarely making it to much of the world's news. The conflict alters the daily life of many areas, particularly northern Syria. As of 2018, the UN reported that the damage to homes, infrastructure, and roads amounted to $120 billion. In 2017, nearly all the homes in Idlib and Aleppo provinces were destroyed in the conflict. More than half of the country's pre-war population has been displaced internally or fled to other countries as refugees. Those who stay behind continue to suffer through deteriorating living conditions such as drought, high temperatures, a water crisis, electricity shortage, and poor healthcare. The United Nations describes the situation as the largest displacement crisis in the world. Syria currently ranks among the globe's top 10 countries with severe food shortages, affecting around 12 million people. At least 25% of the country's hospitals are unable to keep up with the growing medical needs of the people. Healthcare staff are also affected by the war, as some have become displaced or suffer severe injuries in the line of duty. Although fighting in Aleppo stopped in 2016, only a few buildings have been rebuilt. Increasing unemployment and inflation continues to worsen for the average citizen, and this man-made crisis is merely the backdrop to what Mother Nature has just done to the region. The Turkey-Syria earthquake on February 6, 2023 measured 7.8 on the Richter scale and released an explosion equivalent of 7.5 million tons of TNT. It was followed by a 7.7 magnitude aftershock in eastern and central Turkey and a 5.6 magnitude aftershock on the Turkey-Syria border that buried tens of thousands of people under the rubble. There have been over 800 aftershocks since the incident. The death toll from the earthquake has now exceeded 45,000 at the time of making this video, making it the most destructive in decades. Turkish residents account for over 35,000 of the figure. The Syrian Civil Defense, also called White Helmets, said the figure will rise significantly since many more likely remain under the rubble. So far, at least 5 million Syrians have been directly and indirectly affected by the earthquake. Among the worst hit areas are Hama, Idlib, Aleppo, Latakia, and Tartus, the northwestern sections of Syria. In these areas, shops, homes, and major buildings crumbled in seconds. Those who escaped are now sheltered in tents and any place they can find. New patients were rushed to the overstretched hospitals in Aleppo. Despite the many beds at the El Razi hospital, it has not been enough to serve the thousands brought to the hospital. Doctors and nurses are working with a lack of sufficient medical supplies. Infrastructure in these areas have become so damaged that there are now commonly no roads to allow rescue teams access in. They are forced to adopt creative ways to reach people. Meanwhile, despite the earthquake being the deadliest in Turkish history, Turkey fares better than Syria in this situation because it is able to use its infrastructure and social protection systems to respond. Al-Assad's government has claimed it would deliver aid to all of Syria, but the world can sense it is merely a political statement. The UK and US are willing to help and temporarily ease their ongoing sanctions against the Syrian government, which have been in place due to their role in the ongoing civil war. During the same week as the earthquake, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visited Britain, and very soon after, the news of the Syrian earthquake was replaced by his visit. The bond between the UK and Ukraine has since strengthened following Britain's £2.3 billion donation to help Ukraine's ongoing war against invading Russia. However, Britain's £5 million donation to Syria for the earthquake victims pales in comparison. Western leaders had a chance to show they wanted to prioritize humanity over hubris and rebuilding over destruction. Rather, they have left all those affected still longing for a better symbol of hope for their future. The EU's reluctance to be one of the first responders in the disaster was also a concern. The earthquake presented the ideal opportunity for Europe to show its humanity to millions of helpless and homeless people. It offered a chance to speak to them directly, not their government. As important as it is to provide assistance to Ukraine's fight, saving fragile civilian lives should also take center stage. Unfortunately, that's not how the EU and the West chose to distribute their wealth. With no significant sum raised in Britain, Germany or France, the Middle Eastern country of Saudi Arabia has raised over $51 million for Turkey and Syria. While this will still only go so far, it puts the West to shame for not prioritizing humanity during a most dire time. The need for humanitarian aid has also raised debate about the US sanctions against Syria. Assad's regime has seized the opportunity to call for the states to lift sanctions. Many Arab groups and activists agree with the Syrian government on this, something that hasn't happened in quite some time. This, however, is not so straightforward due to the implications around the Syrian government's efforts being backed by Russia, in addition to the role that terrorist groups like ISIS now play. Critics of the Assad regime argue that these sanctions protect Syrians from further harm by denying the government the necessary resources to rearm and launch a new military campaign against millions of residents in opposition-held areas. The US Treasury Office has authorized a 180-day exemption to sanctions so that humanitarian aid organizations can freely carry out recovery work without repercussions. The Syrian government has also opened 2 border crossings to allow aid to flow into rebel-held areas. Time will tell the impact of these decisions. The rest of us watching on at the unspeakable horrors the Syrian and Turkish people are enduring cannot begin to fully understand and relate to their pain and anguish. What needs to take place next is a greater level of attention and response from the international community. People everywhere need to do what they can to urge their leaders to provide more assistance on the ground. Our fellow human beings are being deprived of so many basic needs the rest of us too commonly take for granted. For those who can afford to donate, I'm providing a link in the video description below that shows the best ways to help. Thank you for watching, and please share the love.